The sky above Relinus IV was a mixture of swirling violet clouds and dark red streaks, as though the atmosphere itself was bruised and battered. The once thriving planet had long since fallen into ruin, its cities now crumbling relics buried beneath volcanic ash and toxic air. It was here, in this unforgiving wasteland of monsters and ash, that Zara, a young alien woman from the Serial race, found herself abandoned. Her people had left her for dead, deeming her too weak to contribute to the war effort. The Serial valued only strength and perfection, and those who fell short of their expectations were cast aside. Zara had always been different. With her delicate silver skin, fragile wings, and luminous green eyes, she had never fit the image of strength her people revered. Her slight frame hid a mind filled with ingenuity. Yet that was not enough. Weakness, they said. Useless, they called her. And so, they left her on this monster-filled planet to perish. But Zara did not perish. Not yet. The landscape around her was hostile. Rocky ridges stretched endlessly, jagged cliffs towered, and the ground was riddled with fissures from which toxic gases occasionally seeped. Every breath was a struggle in the poisoned air, and the creatures lurking in the shadows were even deadlier than the planet's atmosphere. Monsters, some towering and grotesque, roamed freely, hunting for anything that moved. Zara's chest rose and fell rapidly, the sting of betrayal still fresh. She crouched behind a boulder, her wings tucked tightly against her back as she surveyed the area. Her body was weak, yes, but her mind was sharp. She would survive, not because her people expected it, but because she wanted to. Zara refused to give them the satisfaction of her death. In the distance, a monstrous creature lumbered past. It was at least 20 feet tall, its skin rough and jagged like the rocks around it, and its eyes glowed a menacing red. It paused, sniffing the air, and Zara froze, her heart pounding. The creature let out a low growl, scanning the area with eerie precision, but after a tense moment, it continued on, its massive form disappearing into the shadows of the cliffs. Zara exhaled slowly. For now, she was safe. She had no weapons, no tools, just her mind and the desolate landscape around her. Her survival depended on her ability to adapt and outsmart the dangers that lurked in every corner. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the land in eerie twilight, Zara knew she wouldn't last long on her own. She had to find shelter before nightfall. The planet's monsters were even more aggressive in the dark. With one final glance at the sky, Zara started moving, her steps quiet and calculated as she searched for refuge in the hostile wilderness. Hours passed as Zara navigated the treacherous terrain, her body weak from exhaustion but her mind determined to keep moving. She found a small cave nestled between two massive boulders, just large enough to offer protection for the night. As she settled in, she could feel the weight of her isolation pressing down on her. She was alone, completely alone. Or so she thought. A sudden roar echoed through the air, followed by a deafening crash that shook the ground beneath her feet. Zara's heart raced as she peered out from her hiding place. In the distance, something fell from the sky. A trail of fire streaked across the clouds before disappearing behind the jagged cliffs. It wasn't a meteor. The descent was too controlled. A ship. Zara's eyes widened with hope and fear. The idea of another being on this forsaken planet was both thrilling and terrifying. What if they were hostile? What if they were here to kill her? But what if they weren't? What if they could help her? The flicker of hope, however small, was enough to spur her into action. She emerged from the cave, her wings fluttering weakly as she navigated the rocky ground. The crash site was a few miles away, but Zara moved with purpose, determined to find out who, or what, had arrived. As she approached the site, she saw it, a human ship, sleek and metallic, with smoke billowing from its side. The craft was clearly damaged, but it was still functional. Zara had never seen a human before, though she had heard stories of them. They were fierce, resourceful, and terrifyingly persistent. They were nothing like her people. And yet, here was a human ship, grounded and vulnerable. Cautiously, Zara approached the ship's hull, her eyes scanning for any signs of movement. Then, the hatch opened with a hiss and a figure stepped out. A human male, tall and imposing, wearing a suit of armor that glinted in the fading light. His eyes were sharp, scanning the area just as Zara had done earlier. He moved with the confidence of someone who had survived many battles, an aura of strength that Zara had never seen before. For a moment, they stood in silence, separated by the vast differences in their worlds. But it was the human who spoke first, his voice calm yet authoritative. "Are you alone?" he asked, his gaze locking onto Zara. Zara hesitated, unsure if she could trust this strange being. But something in his tone, a mixture of concern and determination, made her take a step forward. I was left behind," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The human's eyes softened, and he nodded, as though he understood her plight. He extended a hand, offering her the first real gesture of kindness she had experienced in what felt like a lifetime. "My name is Captain Jackson Hale," he said. "Let's get you out of here." And in that moment, Zara's fate was no longer her own. She had found an ally in the most unlikely of places, but their journey had only just begun. Zara hesitated for a moment, staring at the extended hand of Captain Jackson Hale. The air between them was thick with tension, but there was something in his eyes, a kind of unspoken understanding. She had never trusted anyone before, not even her own people, who had left her to die. Yet here was this human, offering her a chance. Away off this forsaken planet. Slowly, she reached out and took his hand. The moment their hands touched, a surge of emotions flooded her. It wasn't just hope. There was fear, uncertainty, but also a sense of belonging, something she had never felt before. Jackson gently pulled her toward him, helping her stabilize as she stood on shaky legs. The gravity of Arthos was lighter than she was used to, but her energy reserves were depleted from constant survival, leaving her weaker than she had ever been. "We need to move fast," Jackson said, scanning the sky. "This planet isn't safe, especially at night." Zara nodded. Glancing up at the darkening sky, she could hear the distant roars of the predators that prowled the wasteland, their cries echoing across the barren plains. The sun, a deep crimson, was sinking below the horizon, casting long shadows over the jagged landscape. "What are those creatures?" Jackson asked as they began moving away from the crash site, his steps cautious but steady. "Toons," Zara replied, her voice barely audible. "They hunt in the dark, and they're relentless." Jackson cursed under his breath, but didn't slow down. His pace was brisk, purposeful, and for the first time in days, Zara felt a strange sense of security. The human radiated confidence and determination, traits that seemed almost alien to her after so long spent in fear and uncertainty. She followed closely, her wings tucked tightly against her back as they navigated the treacherous ground. After what felt like hours, they reached a small ridge overlooking a valley. Jackson stopped, his eyes scanning the terrain below. Zara followed his gaze, spotting a dark crevice hidden beneath a rocky outcrop. It wasn't much, but it would offer some protection for the night. "We'll rest there," Jackson said, pointing to the crevice. "It's not ideal, but it'll keep us out of sight." They carefully made their way down the ridge, the ground loose and unstable beneath their feet. As they reached the bottom, Jackson helped Zara into the crevice, then wedged himself into the narrow space beside her. It was cramped, but it felt safe. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with exhaustion, fear, and the unknown. "Why are you here?" Zara finally asked, breaking the silence. Jackson glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "I'm a soldier. We were sent here on a mission, but things went wrong. My crew is gone." There was a weight to his words, a grief he didn't bother to hide. Zara's heart ached at the realization that she wasn't the only one who had suffered loss on this planet. They were both survivors of something greater than themselves, stranded in a hostile world with no guarantee of rescue. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice filled with empathy. Jackson nodded but said nothing. He leaned back against the rock wall, his gaze fixed on the entrance of the crevice, ever alert. Zara could see the tension in his posture, the way his muscles coiled, ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. Despite his wariness, he was a man who had learned to live on the edge, much like her. Silence settled over them once more, but it was no longer uncomfortable. In that shared quiet, there was a strange sense of camaraderie, a mutual understanding that neither of them had expected. Zara's thoughts drifted to her own people. The Zephyrin, with their rigid ideals of strength and perfection, had cast her out as weak, a liability. Yet here, with this human, she didn't feel weak. She felt capable, valuable, and perhaps, for the first time in her life, she wasn't alone. As the night deepened, the distant roars of the tunes grew louder, a constant reminder of the danger that lurked just beyond their fragile sanctuary. Zara shivered involuntarily, her wings trembling as a chill ran through her. Jackson noticed and shifted slightly, removing a small thermal blanket from his pack. Without a word, he draped it over her shoulders. "Get some rest," he said quietly. "I'll keep watch." Zara blinked in surprise, her eyes meeting his. "But you need rest too." "I've been through worse," Jackson replied with a small, reassuring smile. "You need your strength. We'll need to move again at first light." His words were practical, but there was a kindness in them that made Zara's chest tighten. She had never expected to find such compassion from a human, especially in a place like this. Reluctantly, Zara closed her eyes, her body sinking into the warmth of the blanket. She was exhausted, physically and emotionally, and though she tried to fight it, sleep came quickly. Her last conscious thought was of Jackson, sitting beside her, a silent guardian in the night. The alliance between them was fragile, built on necessity and survival, but it was real, and in this desolate, monster-filled world, it might just be the thing that saved them both. The journey ahead was uncertain, filled with dangers neither of them fully understood. But as Zara drifted into sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that with Jackson at her side, there was hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way off this planet. But first, they would have to survive the night. Zara woke to the sound of distant growls reverberating through the rocks. Her eyes snapped open, and for a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. The cold stone beneath her and the tight confines of the crevice brought it all back. The crash, the human captain, the alien wilderness. Jackson was still beside her, awake and alert, his eyes trained on the dim opening of their makeshift shelter. The early morning light filtered in, casting long, eerie shadows across his face. "Good morning," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the ambient noises of the waking planet. Zara nodded, still groggy, but grateful to find that they hadn't been discovered during the night. She felt strangely safe, knowing that Jackson had been watching over her while she slept. The sound of her name being called was still fresh in her memory, and she wasn't used to that kind of concern. "How long was I out?" she asked, adjusting the blanket that still clung to her shoulders. "Long enough," Jackson replied, his tone gentle but efficient. "We need to move now. The tombs don't usually hunt during the day, but this place has a way of breaking the rules." Zara nodded, pushing herself up and stretching her cramped wings. She could feel the ache in her muscles, but her rest had done her some good. Jackson handed her a canteen of water, and she drank greedily, trying to ignore the way his eyes lingered on her wings for just a moment too long. She wasn't used to people staring at her deformity, but there was no judgment in his gaze, only curiosity. "What's the plan?" she asked after a few more gulps, feeling slightly more refreshed. Jackson hesitated, his brow furrowing in thought. "We need to get to higher ground. My ship's distress beacon is still operational, but I'm not sure how long it'll take for a rescue crew to get here, if they even receive the signal." And if they didn't, then we're on our own, he said, his tone flat. We'll have to find a way off this rock by ourselves. Zara's heart sank at the thought. The idea of being stranded here forever was a nightmare she didn't want to entertain. But Jackson's calm, collected demeanor reassured her. He seemed like a man who thrived on impossible odds. Without further delay, they began their ascent. The terrain grew rougher the higher they climbed, jagged rocks and shifting soil making every step treacherous. Jackson moved with practiced ease, his armor making him seem like a mountain himself, while Zara struggled to find her footing, her weakened wings only serving as a burden. As they climbed, Jackson glanced back at her. "You doing okay?" "I'm fine," she lied, her breath coming in short gasps. But Jackson wasn't fooled. He stopped and extended his hand, offering her support. "Let me help." Zara hesitated for only a moment before accepting. Pride wasn't worth her life. Together, they continued the climb, Jackson's strong grip steadying her whenever she stumbled. After what felt like an eternity, they finally reached a plateau, a narrow strip of land that jutted out from the mountainside, offering a panoramic view of the barren landscape below. Zara collapsed onto the rocky ground, her wings limp against her back, while Jackson stood at the edge, scanning the horizon. "That's where we need to go," he said, pointing to a distant mountain range, its peaks shrouded in mist. "If we can get to the top of one of those, we'll have a better chance of picking up any signals from orbit." Zara squinted at the range, her heart sinking. It was far, too far for someone in her condition, but she knew better than to complain. Complaining wouldn't change the situation, and it wouldn't get them any closer to safety. "We can make it," Jackson said, as if sensing her doubt. "We'll rest when we need to, but we have to keep moving." Before Zara could respond, a sound echoed through the air, low and guttural. She froze, her eyes widening as she recognized it immediately. The tunes. Jackson's hand went to his weapon instinctively, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the landscape. How close? Zara's heart pounded in her chest. Too close. Suddenly, from the valley below, they saw them, dark, hulking figures moving swiftly through the rocks. The tunes were larger than any terrestrial creature Jackson had ever encountered, their sleek bodies covered in thick, matted fur. Their eyes gleamed with a primal hunger as they stalked their prey. Jackson didn't hesitate. "Run!" he barked. Zara bolted, her wings fluttering uselessly behind her as she sprinted after Jackson. Her lungs burned, and every muscle in her body screamed for rest, but she pushed through, her instincts driving her forward. The tunes were fast, too fast. She could hear their growls growing louder, their claws scraping against the rock as they closed in. Jackson glanced back, calculating their odds in a split second. "This way," he shouted, veering sharply to the left toward a narrow canyon that cut through the mountainside. Zara followed, her legs trembling with exhaustion. The canyon walls loomed high above them, offering some protection from the creatures chasing them, but it wouldn't last long. The tunes were relentless, and they could easily scale the walls if they wanted to. Just as they rounded a bend, Jackson skidded to a halt. Before them was a sheer drop, a ravine that stretched hundreds of feet down into darkness. Zara's breath hitched. "We're trapped." Jackson's jaw tightened, his eyes scanning their surroundings. Then he saw it. A narrow ledge, barely wide enough for one person, running along the side of the ravine. "We'll have to cross," he said, already moving toward it. "It's our only shot." Zara's heart pounded in her ears as she looked at the ledge. One wrong step, and they'd fall to their deaths. But there was no time to argue. The tuned snarls were getting closer, and they had no other options. One by one, they inched their way across the narrow ledge, the jagged rocks cutting into their palms as they gripped the wall for balance. Zara's wings twitched nervously, but they were of no use here. Halfway across, a loud snarl echoed from behind them. Zara glanced back and saw one of the tunes, its massive body balanced precariously on the edge, snarling with rage as it tried to follow them. "Hurry!" Jackson shouted. Zara moved as quickly as she could, her heart hammering in her chest. But just as she reached the end of the ledge, her foot slipped. Scream tore from her throat as she lost her balance, her body pitching toward the abyss. Jackson lunged, his hand shooting out to grab her wrist just in time. He pulled her up with a grunt, his muscles straining, and dragged her to safety. For a moment, they lay there, panting, the tunes howling from the other side of the ravine. Zara looked up at Jackson, her chest heaving with fear and relief. "You saved me." Jackson smiled, breathless but calm. "We're in this together, remember?" Zara nodded, her mind spinning from the near-death experience. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain, she wasn't alone anymore. And together, they just might survive this planet. But this was only the beginning. The tunes were still out there, and the journey ahead was long. Zara's heart still raced from the narrow escape, her limbs trembling as she stood on solid ground once more. The distant howls of the tunes reverberated across the canyon, their cries fading as the creatures realized they could not reach their prey. But their retreat didn't bring much comfort. Zara knew they would find another way to pursue them. This planet's predators didn't give up easily. Jackson remained alert, scanning their surroundings even as he caught his breath. His calm under pressure was reassuring, a trait Zara had never seen in anyone from her world. He seemed to assess each situation like a puzzle to solve, never panicking, always calculating. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice steady despite the close call. Zara nodded, her muscles aching from both exhaustion and adrenaline. But she couldn't afford to rest, not now. She pushed herself to her feet, her wings hanging limp at her sides. As they continued their ascent, the landscape began to change. The jagged rocks and barren soil gave way to a dense, alien forest. Thick vines hung from towering trees, their bark glowing faintly in the dim light. The air grew cooler, but there was something oppressive about the place. A weight in the atmosphere that made Zara's skin prickle. Jackson seemed to sense it too. His hand hovered near the hilt of his weapon as they entered the forest. "Stay close," he murmured, his eyes scanning the underbrush for any signs of danger. Zara followed him, her footsteps careful and quiet. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sent her heart racing, her senses on high alert. The forest was alive with strange noises, distant chirps, guttural growls, and the eerie whisper of the wind through the trees. "This place, it feels wrong," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the ambient sounds. Jackson didn't respond immediately, but she could see the tension in his posture. "We're not alone," he finally said, his voice low. Zara's eyes widened. She scanned the forest, searching for movement, but all she saw were the towering trees and the thick, knotted vines that swayed gently in the breeze. Then she saw it. A shadow, barely visible through the trees, moved in the distance. It was fast, too fast for her to make out any details, but she knew it wasn't human. Her pulse quickened as she realized that whatever it was, it had been watching them. Jackson must have seen it too. He reached for his weapon, his eyes narrowing as he tracked the movement. "Stay behind me." Before Zara could respond, a low growl echoed through the forest. It wasn't a tune. This sound was different, deeper, more menacing. The ground seemed to tremble beneath their feet as the growl grew louder, reverberating through the trees. Zara's breath caught in her throat. "What is that?" Jackson's grip tightened on his weapon. "Trouble." Suddenly, the shadow moved again, this time closer. Zara's eyes darted to the tree line, where she saw something massive emerging from the darkness. It was a creature unlike anything she had ever seen, its body covered in thick, armored plates with multiple glowing eyes that shone like lanterns in the dim forest light. Its limbs were long and spindly, ending in sharp claws that scraped against the ground as it moved. Zara gasped, stumbling backward in fear. What is that thing?" Jackson's jaw tightened. "I don't know," he said, his voice grim, "but it's not friendly." The creature let out a deafening roar, its many eyes locking onto them with a predatory focus. Without hesitation, it lunged forward, moving with terrifying speed for something so large. "Run!" Jackson shouted, firing his weapon in a desperate attempt to slow it down. Zara didn't need to be told twice. She turned and sprinted deeper into the forest, her wings dragging behind her as she fought to keep up with Jackson. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, roots and vines threatening to trip her with every step, but she pushed forward, her heart pounding in her chest. The creature crashed through the trees behind them, its growls growing louder as it gained on them. Jackson fired another round, but the shots seemed to do little more than irritate the beast. "We're not going to outrun it," Zira gasped, glancing over her shoulder at the massive figure barreling toward them. Jackson's eyes darted around, searching for something, anything, that could give them an advantage. Then he spotted it. A steep cliff rising out of the forest ahead. Without slowing down, he pointed toward it. "There," he shouted. "We can use the terrain to our advantage. Head for the cliff." Zira's legs burned with exhaustion, but the sight of the cliff gave her a glimmer of hope. If they could just reach it, maybe, just maybe, they could outmaneuver the creature. They raced toward the base of the cliff, the ground shaking beneath them as the creature closed the distance. Jackson reached the cliff first, quickly assessing their options. The rocky face was steep, but not impossible to climb. "Go," he urged, giving Zara a boost as she scrambled up the rocks. Her wings, though damaged, provided just enough balance to keep her steady as she climbed. Jackson followed close behind, his armor making the ascent more difficult, but his strength propelling him upward. Just as they neared the top, the creature slammed into the cliff with a roar, its claws digging into the rock as it tried to climb after them. Zira's breath hitched as she looked down, seeing the beast's glowing eyes fixed on them, its massive jaws snapping just inches below her feet. Jackson reached the top first and extended his hand. "Come on." With a final burst of energy, Zara grabbed his hand and pulled herself over the edge just as the creature lunged again, its claws scraping against the cliffside. They collapsed onto the rocky plateau, panting and exhausted, but alive. For a few tense moments, they waited, watching as the creature continued to claw at the cliff, its frustration evident in its guttural growls. But eventually, it gave up, retreating into the forest with one last roar of anger. Zara lay on her back, staring up at the darkening sky, her body trembling from the adrenaline. She had never been so close to death, never felt so powerless. Jackson sat beside her, his expression unreadable as he caught his breath. "You did good back there," he said after a long silence. Zara laughed, though it was more from relief than anything else. "I thought we were done for." "We almost were," Jackson admitted. "But we're not dead yet. And as long as we're alive, we've got a chance." Zara turned her head to look at him, a mixture of gratitude and admiration swelling in her chest. "Thanks to you." Jackson met her gaze, his eyes softening just slightly. "We're in this together, remember?" Zara nodded, her heart feeling lighter despite the dangers still lurking around them. They had survived this test, but she knew there would be more to come. And as the sky darkened and the wind picked up, she couldn't shake the feeling that something even more dangerous was on the horizon. The storm was coming. Zara's muscles screamed in protest as she forced herself to sit up. The night was fast approaching, and with it came a cold wind that swept through the forest, carrying with it an unsettling stillness. The usual cacophony of alien creatures had quieted, as if they too could sense the approaching storm. Jackson stood at the cliff's edge, scanning the horizon with a deep furrow in his brow. His stance was tense, alert, as though he expected another attack at any moment. Zara pushed herself to her feet, the chill in the air doing little to soothe her aching body. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the rising wind. Jackson didn't answer immediately, his eyes still fixed on the distant horizon where dark clouds were gathering. After a moment, he turned to face her, his expression grim. "We need to find shelter. real storm is coming, and it's going to be worse than anything we've faced so far." Zara shivered, not just from the cold but from the ominous tone in his voice. The air was thick with the promise of something terrible, something she couldn't quite place. Jackson pointed to a ridge further up the plateau. "There's a cave up there. It's high ground, and it might give us some cover from whatever's coming." Zara nodded, too weary to argue. Together, they began the slow, painful climb toward the cave, each step heavier than the last. The wind whipped around them, biting at their exposed skin, and the sky grew darker with each passing minute. By the time they reached the cave, the storm was almost upon them. Lightning crackled in the distance, illuminating the twisted landscape in brief, blinding flashes. The air hummed with electricity, and Zara's wings fluttered involuntarily, as if reacting to the charged atmosphere. Jackson led the way into the cave, his weapon still at the ready, though it was clear he was just as exhausted as Zara. They collapsed onto the rocky floor, taking a moment to catch their breath as the first drops of rain began to fall outside. For a few moments, they sat in silence, listening to the distant rumble of thunder. Zara pulled her knees to her chest, her wings folding protectively around her body. She felt small, vulnerable, and utterly out of place on this hostile planet. But Jackson's presence was a steadying force, a reminder that she wasn't completely alone. "Do you think the storm will pass quickly?" Zara asked, though she wasn't sure if she wanted to hear the answer. Jackson shook his head. "No, it's not just a storm. It's something more." Zara frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Jackson sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I've seen storms like this before, back on other planets. They're not just natural occurrences. They're disturbances. Sometimes they're caused by shifts in the atmosphere, other times by something more deliberate." Zara's eyes widened in alarm. "You think someone is doing this?" Jackson shrugged, though the look in his eyes was far from casual. "I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised." Zara's mind raced with questions, but before she could voice any of them, a deafening crack of thunder shook the cave, and a sudden gust of wind howled through the entrance, bringing with it a wave of icy rain. Zara gasped as the cold hit her, her wings instinctively wrapping tighter around her body. Jackson jumped to his feet, his hand going to his weapon. "Stay here." "Where are you going?" Zara asked, panic rising in her chest. Jackson's expression hardened. "To check the perimeter. If this storm is more than it seems, we might not be alone." Zara wanted to protest, but something in Jackson's voice stopped her. He was right. This storm, this whole planet, felt wrong. And now, with the sky tearing itself apart outside, the sense of dread that had been gnawing at her since the ship's crash was growing unbearable. As Jackson disappeared into the rain-soaked darkness, Zara was left alone in the cave. The wind outside howled like a living thing, and the rain pounded against the rocks with a ferocity that shook the ground beneath her feet. Her heart raced. Every crack of thunder, every gust of wind made her jump. She wasn't sure how long Jackson had been gone. Minutes, hours. Time seemed to stretch and warp in the storm's chaos. Then she heard it. A noise, faint but distinct, echoed through the cave. It wasn't the wind, or the thunder, or the rain. It was something else. Something alive. Zara froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she turned her head toward the back of the cave, where the shadows seemed to stretch and writhe in the dim light. A pair of glowing eyes stared back at her. Zara's blood ran cold. The creature, the one from the forest, had followed them. Before she could react, the creature lunged, its massive form hurtling toward her with terrifying speed. Zara screamed, throwing herself to the side just as the creature's claws slashed through the air where she had been sitting moments before. She scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest. The creature snarled, its many eyes glowing with a malevolent intelligence as it advanced on her, cornering her against the cave wall. Zara's mind raced. She had no weapon, no way to defend herself. Her wings were too damaged to fly, and there was no way she could outrun it in the confined space. But then, just as the creature prepared to strike, a shot rang out. The creature let out a screech of pain as it staggered back, its glowing eyes flickering in confusion. Jackson stood at the cave entrance, his weapon raised, his expression grim. "Get down," he shouted. Zara didn't need to be told twice. She dropped to the ground as Jackson fired again, the blast hitting the creature square in the chest. The beast roared in fury, its massive form thrashing as it struggled to stay upright. But Jackson didn't stop. He fired again and again, each shot chipping away at the creature's armor like hide until, with one final screech, it collapsed to the ground in a heap. Silence fell over the cave, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder and the steady patter of rain. Zara slowly lifted her head, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The creature lay still, its many eyes now dull and lifeless. Jackson lowered his weapon, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. "Are you okay?" Zara nodded, though her entire body was trembling. I didn't see it. I thought it was gone." Jackson walked over to her, his expression softening. "It wasn't your fault. These things are relentless, but it's over now." Zara nodded again, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed him. The storm still raged outside, and the weight of the danger they had just faced hung heavy in the air. But for now, they were alive, and that was enough. Jackson helped her to her feet, his grip steady and reassuring. "Let's get some rest. We're not out of the woods yet, but we've made it this far." Zara offered a small, tired smile. "Yeah, we've made it this far." As they settled in for what little rest they could find, the storm outside continued to rage, but within the cave, there was a brief moment of calm. Zara closed her eyes, letting the exhaustion wash over her. For now, they had survived, and for now, that was all that mattered. When Zara awoke, the storm had finally passed. The air was crisp and cold, but the oppressive weight of the previous night was gone. Jackson stood at the cave entrance, staring out at the horizon where the first rays of dawn were breaking through the clouds. Zara joined him, her wings stretching as she took in the sight. The world below them looked different now, calmer, more peaceful, as if the planet itself had taken a deep breath after the storm's fury. "Is it over?" she asked softly. Jackson nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on the horizon. "For now." Zara sighed, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in what felt like days. "What happens now?" Jackson turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Now, we find a way off this planet. Together." Zara met his gaze, her heart swelling with gratitude and something deeper. A sense of connection she had never expected to find. Together. And as they set off into the unknown, the future uncertain but filled with possibility, Zara knew one thing for sure: she wasn't alone anymore. And that made all the difference.